The Arctic winds were relentless that year, slicing through the bone like cold knives, indifferent to the men who ventured into its domain. The Franklin expedition had set sail in 1845 with promises of glory, of charting the elusive Northwest Passage. But as the months drew on, hope waned and whispers began to stir. From the distant shores of the Americas and Europe, observers spoke of strange phenomena. Lights glimpsed in the polar night, faint smoke curling in the distance, where no fire should burn. And most disturbingly, reports from the Inuit of ghostly figures wandering amid the ice floes. I first heard of it from a correspondent in New York, a man who had spent years tracking reports from whalers and traders along the northern coasts of Canada. He spoke cautiously, as though uttering the tale aloud might summon it into reality. "Ships found abandoned," he wrote, "but not merely lost. They were frozen in time, untouched by human hands, as if the men had vanished into the wind itself." These accounts became more detailed over time. One described the HMS Erebus, ice-bound near a desolate inlet, her deck frozen solid and her sails shredded. Upon investigation, the officers found personal effects left as if in a hurry. Journals open, quills poised over ink, boots still lined in neat rows. Nothing of the men themselves remained. The Inuit, who had long been attuned to the subtle signs of survival in the Arctic, whispered of people of the ice, their voices trembling. These were no specters, they insisted, but men transformed by the relentless cold, moving like shadows, their faces drawn tight and hollow, unrecognizable as human. It was easy for skeptics to dismiss such stories, attributing them to superstition and fear. Yet every report seemed to carry a ring of authenticity, a common thread that suggested a reality darker than mere accident or misfortune. A British officer stationed at a Hudson Bay outpost wrote of the men who had ventured north to investigate, returning months later with stories of finding graves where bodies should not have been, of seeing tracks that began and ended abruptly on the ice, as though the earth itself had swallowed the travelers whole. In the libraries of London, letters and dispatches chronicled the early optimism of the expedition. Captain Franklin had been regarded as a man of unyielding resolve, and his officers meticulously documented supplies, routes, and scientific observations. Yet the meticulous planning had faltered against the Arctic's unforgiving will. Cold, scurvy, and starvation claimed lives slowly, leaving the survivors to drift in the desolate expanse, their minds fraying with isolation. The strange accounts began to coalesce around a single chilling notion: that the Arctic had not merely claimed these men, but had remade them. Inuit witnesses spoke of figures wandering alone across the ice, neither fully living nor entirely dead, moving with a quiet desperation that mirrored the relentless rhythm of the wind. Ships sent to search returned with logs, noting the unsettling silence of the ice. A silence punctuated only by the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps on snow, never appearing on the horizon. One particularly detailed report came from an American whaler named Samuel Hedges, who had spent the winter near what is now known as King William Island. He wrote of a night when a blizzard fell without warning, obliterating the landscape. In the storm's brief pauses, he claimed to see figures, emaciated, pale, and moving with deliberate slowness, trudging across the ice. He could not identify them, but their presence filled him with a profound unease. By morning, all signs had vanished. No footprints, no traces of passage remained. He later added in his journal that the memory of their hollow eyes haunted him for weeks. As more information reached Europe, the Royal Navy launched multiple expeditions, desperate to uncover the fate of Franklin and his crew. They found only fragments, abandoned camps, scattered supplies, and the skeletal remains of those who had succumbed. Yet even these discoveries did little to quell the rumors. Sailors returning from the north told stories of vessels that appeared intact but lifeless, of seeing masts rising above the ice only to vanish in a sudden fog. Some claimed to hear cries carried across the frozen expanse, echoing with despair, though no human presence could be found. Historians later pieced together that starvation had driven survivors to desperation, yet there remained a consistent undercurrent of mystery. Journals recovered from the ice hinted at a slow descent into obsession and fear. One officer, writing in barely legible scrawl, described the ice watching us, an eerie perception of being observed even in solitude. He recounted leaving a camp to search for supplies, only to return and find everything rearranged, as if the wind had sculpted the objects into new patterns, though the air had been still. It was this subtle, inexplicable behavior of the environment that fed the most persistent rumors, that man had not merely died, but had been absorbed into the Arctic landscape. Letters and oral reports, while contradictory in detail, carried a uniformity in tone, a dread that the North did not simply kill, but erased, leaving behind only fragments of humanity in an endless expanse of ice. By the time word of Franklin's disappearance reached the general public, the stories had begun to intertwine with myth. Newspapers recounted tales of ghostly figures and abandoned ships with a fascination tinged by horror. Some wrote of the expedition as a cautionary tale about the hubris of men attempting to master nature. Others treated it as a mystery beyond explanation, a frozen enigma lurking at the edges of maps and memory. The Arctic, in these accounts, became a character in its own right, silent, patient, and indifferent, a place where human ambition dissolved into whiteness and cold. Search parties pressed further into the ice with each passing year, driven by duty, curiosity, or the faint hope of discovering survivors. Yet the further north they traveled, the more unnerving their reports became. Lieutenant Hobson, leading one such party, recorded in his log the peculiar silence that accompanied them, not merely the absence of sound typical of Arctic desolation, but a weighty, almost tangible quiet, where even the wind seemed hesitant, as if acknowledging the presence of something unseen. He wrote of coming upon a hut built with care, its interior containing meals laid out and unconsumed, as though the occupants had vanished mid-task. The very arrangement suggested a deliberate absence, men who had intended to return but never did. The Inuit, who had observed the foreign sailors with cautious curiosity for generations, offered insights that unsettled the officers profoundly. They spoke of the lingering men, describing thin, shivering figures glimpsed moving among ice ridges at dusk or during the early, ghostly hours before dawn. These were never aggressive, nor did they speak. They simply appeared, watching silently before fading into the whiteness. Sometimes they seemed to mimic the living explorers, taking their movements in eerie imitation, as though trapped in a cycle from which there was no escape. The officers initially dismissed this as superstition, yet reports from multiple independent sources converged on the same phenomena. One particularly harrowing account came from a Danish trader stationed near the mouth of the Coppermine River. He described approaching a campsite abandoned in haste, the snow crisp with footprints that did not belong to men known in the area. The prints twisted and looped in impossible patterns, vanishing abruptly into the ice. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, yet a feeling of wrongness lingered. The trader wrote that upon leaving, he heard faint calls, a mixture of sighs and muttered words, carried across the frozen wasteland by the wind. No man could have survived to make such sounds, yet the cries were unmistakable, lingering in the mind long after they faded. Reports of skeletal remains told part of the story, but even these discoveries deepened the mystery. Many of the bodies were found far from the original encampments, suggesting that the men had wandered, perhaps searching for a route to safety or simply drawn by disoriented desperation. Some bore evidence of frostbite so severe that fingers and toes had been removed, either in an attempt to stave off gangrene or as a grim measure of survival. A few showed signs of cannibalism, a bitter testament to the extreme conditions. Yet no matter the cause, the stories always circled back to the same haunting element. Men had vanished without trace, leaving behind only fragments, personal items, and an enduring sense of dread. In London, newspapers struggled to reconcile the brutal realities of survival with the growing legend of the lost expedition. Letters from sailors and explorers described moments that defied rational explanation: smokeless fires, tents collapsed in unnatural ways, and the persistent sensation of being watched. Observers who had spent weeks traversing the ice spoke of sudden depressions in the landscape that could swallow a man without a sound, or of eerie formations where snow and ice appeared deliberately arranged, as if to mark paths or boundaries. One midshipman, returning from a reconnaissance mission, claimed he had glimpsed the faint outlines of figures atop distant ridges, their movements slow, deliberate, and sorrowful. By the time he reached safety, he confessed, he could not shake the feeling that the men of Franklin's expedition still lingered somewhere, not alive, yet not entirely gone. As years passed, the expedition became enshrined in the lexicon of Arctic legend. Scholars and journalists speculated endlessly, examining diaries, letters, and Inuit accounts for patterns. Some suggested that the isolation and starvation had driven the men to madness. Yet even this explanation failed to account for the reports of ordered, almost ritualistic arrangements of campsites and belongings. Items left behind bore a precision that spoke of thought and awareness, not delirium. Officers' journals, discovered decades later, hinted at a psychological unraveling that began in subtle ways. repeated observations of the ice shifting with purpose, fleeting figures at the edge of sight, and the inexplicable feeling that the wind carried voices that were not imaginary. In 1859, when Sir Edward Belcher led another official expedition to search for Franklin, the reports returned by his men mirrored earlier accounts. They found remnants of ships, utensils, and personal belongings scattered across vast distances, often in locations that made little sense geographically. Belcher's officers described snow and ice formations that resembled humanoid shapes from a distance, evoking fleeting terror and an unshakable impression of presence. Inuit guides attempted to explain, insisting that the Arctic itself sometimes claimed men in ways that left traces without bodies, that the dead and dying often lingered in the frozen landscapes, walking unknowingly, drawn to familiar sights, or driven by forces unseen but deeply felt. The more time passed, the more entrenched these accounts became. Sailors and traders spoke of seeing figures moving among ice floes just beyond the range of rifles or binoculars. Some said that on quiet nights, a faint light flickered across the snow, not from a lantern, but from what appeared to be glints from frozen eyes reflecting moonlight. The Arctic's silence amplified every sound, every distant crack of ice, until even the most rational man questioned whether he truly walked alone. By the late 19th century, Franklin's disappearance had evolved into a cautionary narrative about the limits of human endeavor, but also a story that carried the weight of the inexplicable. Scholars could catalog dates, map routes, and analyze remains, but the subtle, persistent accounts of wandering figures, unclaimed campsites, and the sensation of being observed resisted full explanation. These elements, combined with the stark isolation of the Arctic, transformed the expedition from a tragedy into a lingering enigma. Those who study the journals today often comment on the psychological toll the environment exacted. Men wrote of fleeting hallucinations, of hearing voices and seeing shapes at the periphery of vision. But the consistency of multiple independent reports from explorers, whalers, and Inuit witnesses suggests something more than mere hallucination. The ice itself, in its vast, indifferent expanse, became a theater in which human life was stretched to the limits, sometimes leaving marks of presence without explaining absence. Even in modern examinations, the Franklin expedition remains a symbol of the Arctic's unyielding severity. Archaeologists and historians piece together movements, supplies, and final locations, yet the whispers endure. Of men wandering lost in snow, of footprints vanishing into nothing, of the cold preserving fragments of human life in ways both tangible and uncanny. Each discovery adds clarity, yet deepens the sense of mystery. A reminder that the Arctic, though mapped and studied, retains a vast, inscrutable solitude that refuses complete understanding. The further north one traveled, the more oppressive the Arctic became. Even seasoned explorers, men who had endured months of frost, hunger, and isolation, wrote of a creeping sense of unreality. Lieutenant Hobson and his party, retracing portions of Franklin's route, noted that the ice seemed to shift imperceptibly when unobserved, forming ridges and hollows that were absent moments before. The wind carried voices that at first were dismissed as echoes or imagination, but the repetition, the rhythm of these sounds could not be explained. One officer recorded that he awoke to the sound of men moving across the snow outside the tent, only to find, in the cold light of morning, no footprints, no disturbance of the snow, nothing to account for what he had heard. Survivors' journals, pieced together from fragments recovered decades later, hinted at the slow unraveling of minds under the relentless isolation. Captain Crozier, who had commanded one of the ships, wrote of his men wandering in the snow, seeking the warmth of a fire that is nowhere, calling to comrades who do not answer. Some entries were barely legible, smeared by moisture or hastily written in fading ink, yet the tone conveyed a creeping despair. He described the phenomenon as men drawn into the whiteness, lost to the cold, though their bodies remain, though their minds do not return. Reports from the Inuit continued to corroborate these subtle horrors. They spoke of men moving across the ice alone, appearing and disappearing, sometimes near abandoned camps or wrecked vessels. These figures were described as unusually thin, their movements deliberate but slow, their eyes wide and unfocused. They were not aggressive, but their presence exuded a profound, almost tangible sadness. Inuit hunters often left gifts, tools, food, or clothing near these sightings, a gesture of respect or appeasement, though it was unclear whether the figures ever took them. American whalers who navigated the northern channels in the 1850s and 1860s reported similar phenomena. One such account described a ship approaching a distant inlet where the remains of a tent were visible. A lone figure stood motionless near the shore, partially obscured by snow and shadow. When the ship's crew attempted to approach, the figure vanished, leaving only disturbed snow. Later, closer inspection revealed personal items scattered around the site. A boot, a journal page, a fragment of a coat, all arranged in a manner suggesting that someone had left in a hurry. Yet there was no trail leading away, no sign of human passage through the drifting ice. The psychological impact on search parties was profound. Men accustomed to hardship described sudden, inexplicable panic, as though the landscape itself were closing in upon them. Officers wrote of hearing distant shouts and murmurs, sometimes in English, sometimes in an unrecognizable tongue, carried on the wind across miles of snow and ice. Tent flaps seemed to move without cause. Tools appeared shifted or removed, and small fires extinguished themselves as if deliberately snuffed. Each of these incidents, catalogued meticulously in journals and reports, added to the growing narrative of disappearance without trace, of human presence that left echoes but no substance. In one of the more haunting entries, an officer described discovering a partially buried campsite. The snow had preserved objects in a manner almost ritualistic, utensils arranged in neat rows, papers carefully stacked, and clothing folded as if by a meticulous hand. Yet the tent was empty, the occupants gone. Nearby, footprints led in circles, beginning and ending in the same place, as though the men had wandered endlessly, driven by an unknown compulsion, ultimately disappearing into the white expanse. The officer remarked on the eerie precision of the scene, noting that even the arrangement of objects suggested awareness and intent, not chaos or panic. The cumulative effect of these reports was a growing sense of the Arctic as a realm that exacted more than the toll of weather or hunger. It became a landscape of profound psychological pressure, where isolation magnified fear and subtle phenomena shifting ice, drifting snow, distant sounds were enough to erode the boundaries between observation and imagination. Sailors who had spent months in these conditions spoke of watchers in the whiteness, describing fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when approached, yet left a lasting impression on those who saw them. Decades later, skeletal remains recovered on King William Island offered a grim confirmation of some events. Many bodies showed evidence of extreme malnutrition, frostbite, and signs of survival cannibalism. Yet even these tangible artifacts could not explain the stories of wandering figures, abandoned but orderly campsites, or the recurring accounts of sounds and movements without cause. The ice preserved objects and bodies alike, but it seemed also to preserve the memory of the men's last days, traces of their presence, hints of their desperation, and the pervasive atmosphere of loss. European newspapers and periodicals chronicled the expedition's legacy as both a scientific endeavor and a cautionary tale. Articles recounted not only the hardships of the Arctic, but also the lingering mystery. Some writers speculated that the men, driven to madness by hunger and cold, had succumbed to wandering, leaving only shadows and impressions behind. Others emphasized the eerie consistency of accounts from Inuit observers and whalers. Across decades and hundreds of miles, patterns of disappearance, empty camps, and inexplicable phenomena persisted. Historians examining Franklin's final route noted that the expedition's equipment and provisions, carefully documented, were often found in locations suggesting deliberate movement rather than chaotic collapse. Items were spread across the ice with an almost obsessive orderliness, as if the men had tried to maintain a semblance of control even in their final, failing days. Letters and journal fragments hinted at a psychological awareness that extended beyond mere survival, an attempt to impose structure in a landscape that offered none. The legend of the expedition, though rooted in real suffering and loss, took on a life of its own. Sailors returning from the Arctic carried stories of frozen men who move, of tents that seemed occupied when no one was present, of distant figures glimpsed in blizzards that vanished as soon as they were approached. These accounts, repeated and corroborated, lent a spectral quality to the historical record without resorting to fantasy. The men of Franklin, it seemed, had become inseparable from the ice, their presence lingering in ways both tangible and elusive. The psychological toll endured by subsequent search parties reinforced the narrative. Even the most rational officers described moments of profound unease, a creeping sensation that they were not alone, that the frozen landscape watched and remembered. Men awoke to sounds of footsteps outside tents, to objects mysteriously rearranged, and to fleeting figures glimpsed in the corner of vision. In written records, these phenomena were often qualified, dismissed as stress or fatigue, yet the frequency and consistency of the reports were striking. In sum, the Franklin expedition did not simply vanish. It left behind a trail of human struggle, careful observation, and subtle traces that hinted at presence beyond survival. The Arctic, in all its silent vastness, became a participant in the story, preserving not just bodies or equipment, but the lingering impression of men who endured, wandered, and ultimately disappeared in ways that defy full explanation. For those who study the expedition today, the mystery remains, a tale of courage, endurance, and an environment that exacts a profound psychological toll, leaving echoes of humanity in a realm indifferent to life or death. The last traces of Franklin's expedition lay scattered across a frozen world, indifferent to their suffering. Years of searching had pieced together fragments, a boot here, a journal there, a tent collapsed beneath the unyielding weight of snow. Each discovery hinted at desperation and endurance, yet nothing could fully account for the silence that followed. No survivor returned to tell of their final days. All that remained were objects, skeletal remains, and an atmosphere of absence, heavy as the ice itself. Reports from Inuit hunters offered the clearest glimpse into what may have been the expedition's final descent. They spoke of men leaving their ships, wandering into the desolate expanse in small groups or alone, driven not by purpose, but by the slow erosion of hope. Some carried supplies, many carried nothing at all. They moved like shadows in the snow, stopping to examine the ice as though it could speak, as though it might offer a path to salvation. Yet the ice offered no guidance, only endless, white, and unbroken cold. Those who lingered too long vanished, leaving behind only faint traces, footprints that abruptly ended, objects arranged with care, the occasional journal or note fluttering in the wind. The journals recovered later, smudged with frost and water, reveal a slow psychological unraveling. One officer, writing in ink nearly frozen, recounted his comrades' growing obsession with time and the movement of the ice. "The ice watches us," he wrote. "It shapes itself to our passing, and yet we cannot read its will. Every ridge, every hollow feels deliberate, as though the world itself conspires to guide or mislead us." Another described the relentless gnaw of hunger, how it sharpened perception even as it eroded reason. Men became acutely aware of the faintest signs, a crack of ice, the shimmer of distant water, the shadows of snowdrifts that resembled human figures. Bodies discovered on King William Island and elsewhere along the expedition's route told a grim, factual tale. Frostbite had claimed hands and feet, scurvy had eaten at gums and limbs, starvation had hollowed chests and eyes. Some remains bore evidence of cannibalism, an appalling testament to the extremity of their ordeal. Yet even in the cold clarity of skeletal analysis, there lingered mystery. Several sets of remains were found far from any encampment or navigable route, as though the men had deliberately walked into the barren white, leaving no trail behind. How they survived long enough to reach those points, and why they ventured so far from supplies, remained unanswered. The Arctic itself had become both graveyard and witness, ships abandoned, personal belongings meticulously arranged, campsites left in eerie order, All suggested that even in their final hours, the men clung to routine, to the fragile semblance of control that human minds impose on chaos. Some officers wrote of seeing shadows of comrades across ice ridges, glimpses so brief and fleeting that rational explanation faltered. These sightings, dismissed at first as hallucinations, multiplied across decades of exploration. Whalers, search parties, and Inuit alike described emaciated figures moving with deliberate slowness, sometimes seen through blizzards, sometimes just beyond the horizon, vanishing when approached. The phenomenon that most haunted observers was the consistency of the traces, footprints that ended abruptly, items left in precise order, fires built but never lit, tents collapsed as if hastened by invisible hands. The Arctic did not kill in a single moment. It claimed incrementally, eroding resolve, gnawing at sanity, and leaving behind subtle evidence that men had existed in its white vastness. For every body recovered, there were countless imprints of lives that had been traces of human presence dissolving into the landscape without resolution. Decades later, as historians and archaeologists examined the evidence, they noted the psychological strain implicit in the artifacts. Men forced to walk for days in sub-zero temperatures, subsisting on frozen meat or minimal rations, exposed to wind that could strip skin from bone, would inevitably suffer delirium and hallucination. Yet, even allowing for these factors, the precision of abandoned campsites and the recurrence of strange, fleeting observations by independent witnesses resisted full explanation. The narrative of the expedition became dual, one of tragic, tangible suffering, and one of subtle, persistent mystery. The last known movements of Franklin and his officers seemed to follow a pattern of incremental desperation. Ships abandoned when navigation failed, small groups venturing into ice fields in search of game or open water, men succumbing to frostbite and scurvy along the way. The fragments of journals suggest that some understood the likelihood of death and recorded their experiences with a stark clarity born of awareness. They marked dates, tracked movement, observed the behavior of ice and snow, and occasionally reflected on the unyielding nature of their surroundings. "We are small," one entry reads, "yet we are seen by all that watches us. The cold knows us. It will not forget." There are accounts of men disappearing from tents, leaving journals open as though mid-thought, and items arranged with deliberate care. One officer wrote, "We left in haste, yet not in panic. The snow observes, and we obey its rhythm." Others describe attempts to preserve dignity and order to the last, neatly folded clothes, organized tools, and careful stacking of supplies. It was as if the Arctic, in all its indifferent silence, demanded a performance even in death, a ritual of presence and absence, of survival and surrender. The final chapters of the expedition, pieced together from scattered records, suggest that most men succumbed in isolation. Small groups became lost amid ice ridges and snowdrifts. Individuals wandered alone for days, driven by hunger or instinct, or perhaps seeking reunion with companions lost elsewhere. Some were found years later, remarkably preserved in ice, faces frozen in expressions that speak of fatigue, resolve, or quiet despair. others left no trace at all, swallowed by snow, or hidden within the endless folds of the Arctic landscape. Even in modern times, the expedition retains an unsettling resonance. The frozen items and skeletal remains provide evidence of reality, but they cannot fully convey the intangible aspects, the subtle, persistent traces of lives once lived and then erased, the reports of figures moving just beyond the periphery of vision, the silent cries carried by the wind across miles of unbroken white. These elements form a shadow history, a story that exists both in fact and in the quiet suggestion of the unseen. Ultimately, the Franklin expedition did not vanish in myth alone. It vanished into the vast, silent environment it sought to chart. It became a story of human ambition tested against the limits of endurance, of men caught in a world far colder, more indifferent, and more vast than any map could contain. The ice preserved fragments of their existence: tools, papers, clothing, bodies, but the majority of their lives left no permanent mark. The Arctic, patient and immutable, absorbed them slowly, leaving whispers on the wind, traces in the snow, and a profound, enduring sense of absence. It is perhaps the quietest aspect of the story that makes it most haunting. The Arctic does not announce its claim. It does not strike with violence or spectacle. It waits, preserves, observes, and erases. And in this still, white vastness, the men of Franklin persist in absence, their footsteps faint, their voices carried on the wind, their presence felt in every abandoned tent and scattered fragment. They are gone, yet in subtle ways. The ice remembers them, and those who venture there still sense, in fleeting glimpses or inexplicable sounds, the enduring mark of lives claimed by silence, cold, and time itself.